Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Object Talk Live. My name is Shireen, and I am a learning officer at the Jewish Museum, and I am delighted to be hosting today's Object Talk. Now, Object Talks are an opportunity for our online viewers to learn something new about the Jewish Museum London collection. And today I am delighted to be sharing with you all two incredible photos of the Beta Israel Ethiopian Jewish community. Now, this month at the museum, we are focusing on themes of freedom. And this community knows freedom, especially recently, quite well. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and show you images of this community. Now, here are some photos of the Beta Israel community from the Jewish Museum London. Now, perhaps some of you might know of this community as the Falasha community. Now, although the word Falasha is quite commonly used, it is actually a word from the native Ethiopian language Amharic and has quite derogatory connotations, meaning landless, wanderer, people without a home or a land. And therefore, we prefer to identify this community as they prefer to self-identify, as the Beta Israel community. Beta Israel, Hebrew words meaning the house of Israel. Now, as with many African communities, the Beta Israel community has carried much of its culture and its history in quite an oral manner. Now, what that means in the Western world is that many people struggle to find the root or source or foundation of this community because of the lack of written resources and sources of this community. But nonetheless, the foundation or source of this community has been mostly attributed to three main things. Now, some people argue that the Beta Israel community is a result between the relationship between the Queen of Sheba, apparently, and the King Solomon. Others would argue that the Beta Israel community is a result of the diasporic movement after the destruction of the First Temple, whilst some would argue that the Beta Israel community is a result of one of the lost tribes. But nonetheless, this is a Jewish community with its roots very much in history for many hundreds, thousands of years. Now, today I want to focus on a specific part of history, and that's the 1980s to the 1990s. Before I do, though, I want to mention one thing. Now, this community, because of its lack of connection with the international Jewry for much of its history, actually practiced a very specific type of Judaism. Now, this was a Haymanot Judaism. And when we use the word Haymanot, we are talking about religions such as Judaism that has been very much interpreted and molded by Ethiopian culture and traditions. So much of the Ethiopian Jewish religion, for much of their history, was a very specific Ethiopian practice of Judaism. But nonetheless, this community is Jewish. But it wasn't until their connection with the international Jewry in roughly around the 1980s to 1990s that this community began to adopt more internationally recognized standards of Judaism. But before we get there, let's focus on what was happening in Ethiopia and to this community roughly around the 1980s and 1990s. Now, during 1984 to 1991, Mengistu reigned in Ethiopia. And through his reign, many Beta Israel people, Jews of Ethiopia, were persecuted, tortured, and murdered. Under his reign and one of his many coups, over 2,500 Beta Israel Jewish people were killed. And in the early 1980s, Ethiopia forbade the practice of Judaism in its entirety and the teaching of Hebrew. Now, this persecution of the Beta Israel community really became news and caught the attention of many international Jewish communities and organizations beyond Ethiopia. And it was at this moment that many people in Israel thought, how best can we help our Ethiopian brothers and sisters? And what was organized is this: a few covert, secret airlift operations that would organize the Better Israel community of Ethiopia to be carried to safety in Israel, to be freed. Now, perhaps you've heard of some of these operations, for example, such as Operation Moses. Now, Operation Moses was one of the first secret operations that happened at the end of 1984 and beginning of 1985, saving or freeing some 8,000 Ethiopian Jews. And later on in that year, there was Operation Joshua, saving around 500 Jewish people from Ethiopia. But the photos that you see on the screen today are from Operation Solomon, one of the largest secret operations carrying these Ethiopian Jewish people to Israel. Now, Operation Solomon was an operation that happened, or started, I should say, on May the 24th, 1991. And it was a 36-hour-long operation, transporting, commuting, taking over 14,000 Better Israel Jewish people from Ethiopia to freedom in Israel. Now, among, or across, I should say, these 36 hours, there were 35 Israeli aircrafts carrying these thousands of Ethiopian Jewish people to Israel. Now, one of these aircrafts actually broke a world record. And that is because there are stories in which on one of these aircrafts, the seats had to be taken out to accommodate as many of these Better Israel community, or people I should say, as possible. And in one aircraft alone, 1,088 people sat. There are stories and testimonies of babies that were born on these aircrafts. This was an emergency, and this was with urgency as well. But nonetheless, after these operations, and specifically Operation Solomon, many of the Better Israel community found a home now in Israel, making Aliyah. Now, the majority of the community actually does find its home in Israel. But despite that, and despite finding freedom in Israel, it does not mean that this community story has been simple. As Black people in Israel, many of these people have had to fight for their rights, and so on. There have been many cases of the Better Israel community fighting for their rights within the Israeli space, but nonetheless, slowly but surely, the Better Israel community and its members are increasingly becoming embedded and integrated in the society across many different spaces and sectors. And one last thing I wanted to mention was a festival that perhaps celebrates the freedom of the Better Israel community in many ways, historically, but to this day as well. And that is the festival of Sigid, S-I-G-D, perhaps a festival that you have heard of already. Now, this is one of the unique holidays that the Better Israel community celebrate. It is about the acceptance of the Torah, but also about the yearning for Aliyah, for going to Israel, and also for rebuilding a temple. This is a festival that the community has been celebrating for many years. During this festival, they will fast and read scriptures and recite the Psalms. And after their fast, they will end their fast with a very special meal and dancing and celebrating. But now this festival, Sigid, holds a very special meaning. Now most of this community has made Aliyah and has found home in Israel. And since 2008, Sigid has become a recognized state festival and state holiday in Israel as an opportunity to raise awareness about the Better Israel community and Black Jewish communities in Ethiopia, and to educate Israeli Jews and others of this very special community, celebrating who they are and their freedom now. So that is a bit of insight into the Better Israel community today. And to learn more, we do invite you to join one of our Black History tours at the Jewish Museum London, where we explore this community and other communities of Black identities that identify as Jewish as well. But until then, I wish you a very happy and great day. And please do make sure to join us for our next object talk next week, Wednesday. Until then, goodbye, and thank you so very much for joining me today. Bye-bye.